AskReddit by carnivorous dentist. What type of death was common 100 plus years ago that is very rare today? Before antibiotics, people would die right and left from bacterial infections. Consumption. Infection. Calvin Coolidge's son died of a blister from not wearing socks while playing tennis on the White House tennis court. That was less than 100 years ago. We are so lucky. My best friend's mom died of a cyst on her foot. It burst, she got sepsis, and she died. In 2021. Polio. This one. The iron lung thing sounds like a terrible way to live, even if you did survive. Accidental poisonings. Arsenic, mercury, lead, etc. Also penicillin was discovered until 1928, so a lot of infections were pretty deadly. Honestly, intentional poisonings have gone down too, thanks to no-fault divorce. 100 years ago, tooth infections had a relatively high mortality rate, 1 in 10 would die. 400 years ago, tooth infections were basically a death sentence and one of the leading causes of death in Europe. Today, tooth infections are easily dealt with. The discovery of antibiotics is by far the greatest achievement in human history. Still a massive factor in the development of cardiac infections. Anything involving a horse. Instead of kicked to death by a Mustang, now you get rolled over by a Mustang. It was recently the 100-year anniversary of successfully treating type 1 diabetes. It was a death sentence before 1922. Drug companies are trying to bring it back in the US with predatory pricing. Smallpox. Pertussis. Measles. Bubonic plague 2. Tuberculosis. XMDR-TB scares me more than HIV. That's tuberculosis that is resistant to all known treatments, and while it's very rare, there are sanatoria in equatorial areas for people who have this, so they can be kept comfortable until they die, and not spread it in the community. Dysentery. Pellagra in the US was common due to the heavy use of corn in rural diets. Eventually led to the discovery and understanding of vitamins in the early 1900s when the government was trying to pin down the cause of it. Nasty way to go. Looking for this one. Corn has a crazy calories per hectare ratio, and can provide many key nutrients if processed correctly. Most notably, if you nixtamalize the corn, treat with lime mineral, not fruit, it is a good source of niacin. Without that treatment, it provides almost none. As corn became a staple crop for the poor in the US South, they ignored the backward processing done by the natives and essentially starved themselves, as without the niacin they could not metabolize all those calories. Infection. It still happens now, but it was way more frequent. And it seems to be making a comeback. I work as a rehab therapist and we've seen so many people die of sepsis recently. They go in for benign surgeries, never make it home. A lot of failing amputations and orthopedic surgeries, too. Nobody has mentioned bad hips. Today hip replacement is fairly routine, although there are sometimes complications. 100 years ago when your hip went bad they gave you a wheelchair and a bottle of morphine and you'd be dead in a year or two. Today still many elderly people die from breaking their hip. I did research into it for work, ironically. Turns out the majority of people who break their hip do so in the middle of the night while halfway awake and getting out of bed on their way to the bathroom. By doing bladder exercises on the elderly it saves lives. They had some wild ass execution methods back in the day, Mayo. Guillotine. You could make a religion out of no, don't. Diarrhea. My stepfather essentially died of diarrhea in a modern hospital in 2018. It was a side effect of chemo. I don't know exactly what happened as I am in a different country and my mother is still too upset to discuss it. Which means it must have been really awful. She's the most pragmatic and unsqueamish person I know. Smallpox. It killed 300-500 million people in the 20th century alone. It is extremely contagious and has a 30% fatality rate, and those who do survive are often severely scarred. Pneumonia in young people. Measles. Polio. Smallpox. Diphtheria. TB. Childbirth. Sudden infant death syndrome. This one is so scary to me. Imagine carrying your child for 9 months, going through labor and everything looks good, and then your baby dies. Diseases like tuberculosis, influenza and pneumonia were common causes of death 100+ years ago but are now relatively rare due to advancements in medicine, vaccinations and public health measures. It's not rare, but cancer used to be way more deadly. It was a death sentence. You weren't discussing treatment options, you were discussing pain management options and end-of-life care. Especially with childhood leukemia, a remarkable medical achievement. Blood infection due to dental cavity. My father died of that 2 years ago. The infection from his tooth traveled to his heart and ate away his artificial valve. I had no idea that was even a possibility. Consumption. In Victorian times it was all the rage. A very romantic disease to die from in novels at the time and actually quite hellish in reality. Tuberculosis was actually already on the way out a century ago thanks to science, but ever since the 80s it has been making a resurgence thanks to AIDS and the rise of drug-resistant strains. Deleted. Being killed by someone who was born in the 1800s. Not rare. The bozo in this thread trying to disprove everyone, probably,